Okay, so in this video, what we're going to do is we're going to do some practice with our watercolor that you have received. You should have two colors. These are examples from the video I did prior to this that didn't work out so well. So we're going to use those as references for the new practice paper. And then you want to grab a cup of water and your brush. Some tape, preferably some masking tape so it doesn't rip your paper up, a pencil, some scissors, a ruler. I did not actually bring a ruler for this video, so I'm using a measuring tape. Whatever works for you works for me. Your two colors that I gave you that you picked out, a paper towel, and then you may want something like a board or a book that you can prop your painting on, and then something to put under that board. I'll talk to you about that a little bit later in the video so you can see why it's important and why we use something to prop our paintings on. So I'm going to get started. First thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to use my tape measure, and I'm going to measure about 1.5 inches on each side. And then right under that, I'm going to measure 2 inches, and these are going to create sections that you will do exercises in. So now you want to grab your tape, and what you're going to do is you're actually going to tape off the sections so the watercolor won't roll into each other. It'll keep each exercise separated, which will be good because you don't want them blending into each other. So I'm just going to put some tape right above those markings on the 1.5 inch section that I drew out earlier. At the top, this is going to be a value scale. So I'm going to take another piece of tape, and I'm actually going to put it below the markings, and I'm going to tape those off. And I'm going to take one more long piece, and I'm going to get my scissors. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually just going to cut that in half, and I'm going to use that to separate the middle section into thirds. We're going to do 3 different exercises in the middle section. And I'm using my best judgment to section them off in thirds. If you want to actually use a ruler or measuring tape or whatever you have at home, you can do that. That's totally fine by me. I'm just going to eyeball it. So in this section right here, I'm going to do a value scale like I explained beforehand. What I want you to do is just get set up. I'm going to adjust all my supplies to the side real quick, and then I'm going to clean up my space so I can get started. I'm going to secure the sides and just tape down my watercolor paper. Then I'm going to pick a color. You don't need the second color for this, just one color. We are going to do, just like we did in drawing, a value scale of one color that you have going from darkest to lightest. So at the top of your paper, I want you to write down value scale. Okay, the next thing that you're going to do is get your brush, and you want to clean it out really well. Use your paper towel to dry off the water, the excess water that your brush may be holding. And right on the side, so I'm going to zoom in just real quick so you can see, right on the side of your watercolor, you want to pick up as much pigment as possible. So I'm not really grabbing it from the middle. The middle usually holds all the water, and we'll talk about, why that section might be important to use, but you're just going to grab as much pigment as possible on the side and load up your brush. So I'm using the practice paper that I had originally started out with as a reference. So as you see, coming from the left, this is the darkest value that I have with the blue that I selected. So when you are trying to get the darkest value in your watercolor, you want to add as much pigment from your cup as possible. And what we'll do is we'll go back and actually darken it, because with watercolor, it's all about layering. So we're going to let it dry just a bit, so then we can go back and darken it even more by adding some pigment. If you want to lighten the value of your watercolor, you would just dip your brush into the water and dilute the pigment, so there isn't as much pigment on your brush. Each time you want to lighten it, just go back and dip your brush into the water, and then you should get a lighter value. What I'm doing is I'm doing every 2 squares to lighten up the value. And then what I'm going to do is, you'll see later on in the video, I'm going to go back, and the values that look similar, or maybe they're exactly the same, I'm going to either darken one or I'm going to lighten one. And I'll show you how to do that in just a moment. So now that I got the first round of watercoloring done, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back and I'm trying to pick up more pigment to darken the very darkest value that I have. So I'm applying another layer, and I'm going to see if I can make it even darker. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back, and if I see 2 squares that are the same value, what I'm going to do is I'm either going to darken or lighten them. First, I'm going to start out by just darkening them. And what I'm going to do is just grab a little bit of the pigment. Now, the area in the middle of your tiny tray of watercolor that has a little bit more water than the sides, this is a good area to pull from because the pigment is a little bit more watery than the pigment that's on the side. So you can blend it a little bit better. So I'm taking a little bit from the middle and I'm just going back and I am blending as much as possible with my brush. It does take a lot of time and patience. Now, if you remember when we were drawing, you remember blending and transitioning took a lot of time. That is the same thing with watercolor. You have to be very patient. If you notice that your blending is looking a little bit blotchy, take your brush, clean it out, dip it in some water and get some of that extra residue out, and then just take a clean brush in and then just try to smooth those areas. What you don't want to do is add more pigment to those areas because what it will do is it'll just make it more blotchy, it'll darken it. So just make sure you dip your brush in the water and then clean it out onto the paper towel and go back and just blend everything out so it's nice and smooth and it looks neat and your craftsmanship looks on par. So this is the value scale. Okay, so once you complete a value scale, we're going to move on to the next 3 exercises. Those will be a flat wash on your very left, the middle will be a gradient with one color, and then the last one on the very right will be a blend of the 2 colors that you have. Okay, so what you want to get is a board. I have a old canvas that I'm going to use and something just to prop that board up so it's at a 45-degree angle. You want it to be at an angle because what's going to happen is the watercolor is going to pull down, and you'll need that to transition, to add a gradient, to do a flat wash whenever you're watercoloring. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to tape my practice paper up to the canvas. It is at an angle, so everything that I do is going to obviously fall down. So what I want you to do on the very left is go ahead and wet the top section of the square and then grab some pigment. You can grab some pigment in the middle of your tray so it's, a little bit more watery and easy to work with. And you're just gonna load up that section with watercolor. And then what you're gonna do is you're going to move your brush from left to right, and then scanning down, you're going to pull that watercolor and that pigment all the way to the bottom of that section. And you wanna be careful and make sure that you're moving your brush in the same direction so it looks nice, smooth, and consistent. And then go all the way to the bottom. Now from here, we're going to clean up the excess watercolor that we have on the side. So what you want to do is just dry your brush off with your paper towel and then just soak up all the excess on the sides and just clean up your space. So I'm just going to clean up the sides with a paper towel. So that is a flat wash. So the next thing you want to do is you don't have to pull the tape right away. What you could do is you can leave it on and just move to the next section. I'm going to pull the tape and I'm going to carefully make sure that I don't mix the two sections together. So what I want you to do is just grab some more watercolor. Now you're going to go from the side and you're going to make it super, super dark by picking up all that pigment. And then from the top, you're going to put your darkest value right on. Okay, I'm going to keep loading it up and making it as dark as possible. And then from here, you're just going to add a little bit of water to your brush. Okay, and then you're going to pull the value down. Now notice how on the very left, I accidentally touched the other square that I just did, the flat wash. You want to be careful not to do that because the dark values will start blending into that flat wash and you don't want that to happen. So I'm trying to get as close as possible to the edge without actually touching it. And then I'm dipping my brush to lighten the value. And then I'm just pulling down. Right away, you can start to see the gradient. And what I'm going to be doing throughout this section is blending as best as possible. So I'm going to add a little bit more value in some areas. And then I'm going to start blending out those values so it has a nice consistent gradient. When you get to the bottom of this section, I'm noticing that I have I have way too much water and way too much pigment, so I'm going to sop up some of that excess water and pigment so I can get a lighter value. Dipping my brush, I lightened up the value, and now I'm going to go back and just blend out everything so it looks nice and consistent. And I'm just drying my brush a bit and just smoothing out those transitions. Notice how I'm feathering. I'm doing very short, small strokes with the brush and just transitioning those values so they look nice and neat. You want to blend as much as possible and as smooth as possible so the final product looks really good. I'm going to go back and add just a little bit more pigment at the top to see if I can push the darks. I want to get the darkest value as possible, so I'm going back for a second layer. And then what I'm going to do is blend and smooth out those values, and then I'll be done. So the next technique that you will be doing is blending two colors together, and you will be doing a technique called wet on wet, and that is where you wet the canvas before you apply the watercolor. So what I'm going to do is pick up some water, and I'm going to lightly brush a layer of water on top of the watercolor paper. Make sure that it is not too thick. You just want a nice thin layer of water, just enough to dampen the paper. So I'm going to grab my second color, and I'm actually going to start out with the color that I haven't been using. This is a magenta, a very beautiful magenta. And what I'm going to do is load up my brush, grabbing from the sides. I'm going to apply my darkest value right in the corner. And then I'm just going to pull that value out. And what I'm doing is creating a blend between two colors in the direction of a diagonal. So I'm actually going to start out at the corners and then paint all the way to the middle in a diagonal direction. And then I'm going to go back and I'm going to try to darken the corners just a bit, and then blend that value right out into the middle value. I'm going to dry my brush a bit, and then I'm just going to transition and blend those values out. So the next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to grab my other color, and what I'm going to do is clean out that magenta pigment that I had. This is a pro tip. Before you ever try to paint, make sure you rub your brush against something that's white, whether it's a paper towel, just to check to see if you have any pigment left in your brush. I'm going to grab that blue, and I'm going to start at the other corner, and I'm going to work my watercolor in a diagonal direction until it meets that magenta. And what you'll start seeing with the two colors that you have is they'll start mixing, and right in the middle you should see them blend, and you're going to try to feather those two colors together until they look well blended. I'm getting a nice purple with the blue and magenta blended together. So what I'm going to do for the rest of this section is I'm going to try to blend out these colors so they don't look separated. I'm going to try to darken some values that look a little blotchy. I just want these two colors to look consistent when they are blended together. So I'm working on my craftsmanship, making sure I lift watercolor where it needs to be lifted if it's a little bit too dark, and where I add a little bit more pigment if the section looks too light. After I make those corrections, I'm just going to take my brush, clean it out really well, and then blend everything out. Okay, so now that this is done, here are my 4 exercises: value scale, flat wash, a gradient, and a 2-color blend. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull off the tape. I'm going to pull off my practice paper, off my base, off my canvas that I have, and I'm just going to pull the tape. This is so satisfying. So here is what you should have. So what we're going to do is we are going to make a sphere with a light source. I'm going to add that in so you can see what that looks like, the final product. So now you want to kind of search your house for something that is circular. I'm just looking around my desk and I'm going to find something that's a circle just so I can trace over it. Something super small, nothing really big. And then what you're going to do is just trace a circle. You can hand draw a circle if you want to. I'm just making this a little bit easier for myself and just tracing around. That way I can just focus on the watercolor and the technique that I'm about to teach you. So now what you want to do is grab an eraser and just erase the lines just enough so you can still see them. And then I'm going to drop a reference photo into this video and show you exactly how you want to set up your sphere. So when you are mapping out this sphere, you want to draw curved lines that go in the shape of the sphere. That's going to help you with direction with your watercolor. And then you want to add a light source. Wherever you add that light source, just make sure you know that that's going to be the lightest area when you are watercoloring. So I'm going to put the light source right here at the top right. Okay, it doesn't have to be anything extravagant. This is just to help you map out where you're going to add your values. So I went ahead and grabbed a different color what you want to do is just load your brush up with as much pigment as possible. And then we're going to start with the darkest value. Now you want to paint on the section that is closest to the bottom left, but not the very bottom left section. So we're going to leave that light for now. And then just paint in the shape or the direction of the sphere. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back and I'm going to dilute my pigment, and then I'm going to go right above that dark value and just continue in that shape. And I'm going to blend everything out so everything's transitioned well. I'm just trying to get the pigment down so then I can start blending. I wiped my brush off so it's a little bit dry, took some pigment out of the brush, and now I'm just feathering that seam. And this is to make that dark value and the lighter value right above it mesh well. If I need a little bit more pigment, then I'm going to grab it to transition it better and just blend it out. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to paint that bottom left section, the one that I told you to leave blank. We are going to watercolor it the value, that lighter value that we just did above the dark value, but now we're going to do it below. Okay, and then we're just going to blend that out. If you can darken the value that you first started with, I would go back. If, for instance, I did not get the darkest value that I could, so I'm just going to layer another layer of watercolor on top of that dark value. Now I'm on to the lighter sections. I diluted the pigment on my brush, and now I'm going to bring that pigment up and around that sphere. And then I'm going to blend out those transitions. Now where your light source is on your sphere, you want to leave that blank. And that is because the area that the light source touches, it's going to be the lightest value that you watercolor. After that, you want to go right below where the shadow is, where the cast shadows are, and you just want to apply your darkest value right under your sphere in this section. And then you're going to take some of that pigment out, and then you're just going to lighten up that value and bring that value all the way out. I'm blending the seams so everything's transitioned. And then I'm going to go over to the right side and I'm just going to take that value out. I'm going to touch up some few spots on the sphere so it looks consistent. You can take it a step further after this dries and erase those pencil marks that I accidentally left on there. Okay, and with those finishing touches, I am done. So here is the final. So we have a full value scale from dark to light. We have a wet on dry, flat wash at the very left, and in the middle we have a wet on dry gradient, and then a wet on wet 2-color blend. And at the very bottom we practice some 3-dimensional shapes with watercolor doing wet on dry. So I hope this was very helpful for you, and these are the fundamental techniques for watercolor.